Good evening, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, coming at you this evening for another one of our live programs hosted by the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'm very excited to be joined this evening by a good friend of mine and an excellent historian in all things Civil War medicine, Clarence Hickey. How are you doing tonight, Clarence?
I'm doing great, Jake. Nice to see you.
Well, thanks for being here. Clarence has a wonderful presentation for you all this evening on Dr. Stonestreet, someone he is very familiar with and who he will familiarize you with this evening. You're going to get a look at one surgeon's perspective of Civil War medical care, what that was like, and how that fits into this broader picture of Civil War medicine. For those of you who have been tuning in with us over the past several months, it is hard to imagine, but we have been doing this now online, these live programs, for 4 months now. I don't know where that time has gone. It feels simultaneously like it has gone extremely quickly and has dragged on forever. But we've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of incredible historians in the field of Civil War medicine and others associated with Civil War medical care, associated with modern medicine, or those who are doing some work that relates to what was going on back during the Civil War time period and the monumental health crisis that really helped to form the American healthcare field as we know it today through the Civil War. If you are enjoying these videos, enjoying these programs, you can support us in various ways at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You can support us by clicking like on this video, going and giving us that thumbs up or the heart, or if you really want to, the angry face, which some people have done over the months that we've been doing these videos. You can help us by sharing the video as well. That allows people in your network, wherever you may be, if that's in the United States or around the world, you can help to share these videos by using that share feature here on Facebook. Allows more people to join into the conversation. And this is a conversation. We want to have your input as a viewer into this conversation. So if you are watching the video, you are enjoying these videos, go over there, click the comment button, let us know where you're watching from, share how much you've enjoyed these videos. As the presentation is going on this evening, add in your questions. We want to answer those questions. We want to make this video as instructive as possible to you. So if you have any questions, we will get to them at the conclusion of Clarence's program tonight. One last pitch: if you really enjoy these videos and you want to take it to the next level, your support, consider becoming a member of the museum. The National Museum of Civil War Medicine is a nonprofit institution. Up to recently, we were closed to the public due to the pandemic. We have reopened in the past several weekends, which has been wonderful. You can find information about that on our website as well. But a membership supports our programming. It supports videos like this. It allows us to continue doing this work, even though we are mostly having our doors closed. We are open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You can support us and these programs continue allowing us to talk to you via the wonders of the internet by becoming a member or becoming a donor. And you'll find information about that shortly in a link in the comments section of the video. So if you are enjoying these videos, please consider supporting us through membership or through donations. And thank you to those of you who already have done that. So this evening's presentation is going to be brought to you by Clarence Hickey, and I want to allow him to introduce himself a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Clarence, and how you got interested in Civil War medicine?
Wow, thank you, Jake. Well, then we might need another hour on the video to to really do that. I wouldn't do that to you. I'm in Rockville, Maryland, south of where Frederick is, and Rockville is actually the county seat here of Montgomery County. And I am a reenactor, a portrayer, an interpreter at a very tiny little museum in Rockville, which I will show you in my slideshow, the Stonestreet Museum of 19th Century Medicine. I got involved there more than 20 years ago just as a volunteer. And I liked it so much, and it was so interesting, that I became involved and started taking training in 19th century medicine and Civil War medicine, local history, and the life of this man I'm going to introduce to you tonight. And I am a biologist by background. I have a master's in marine biology, and I was drafted into the Army in 1966, and I was assigned as a new biologist just graduated college, was drafted and assigned to an Army hospital, which I'm going to show you. I've got some photos of this place where I was. And once I got involved in the local history and Civil War medicine and 19th century medicine, I had this aha moment about my Army service. And I will explain that to you with some photos in my show. But the person of Edward Stonestreet, to whom I will introduce you, was one of those people for all seasons, a wonderful man who I've come to really admire, and I portray him, and sometimes he's my alter ego, I guess. And I came to really admire him and who he was and what he stood for. And I'll explain a bit about that tonight too, Jake.
Excellent, excellent. I will say my personal connection with Clarence, I have to say Clarence was my first introduction to Civil War medicine and to the realities of Civil War medicine and not just the myths. Before I started working for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in 2013, I was a mere volunteer for the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area in Frederick, Maryland, and ended up being voluntold to participate in a living history program at a church in downtown Frederick, and I was one of the patients being treated by Dr. Stonestreet, Clarence portraying Dr. Stonestreet, and so I was there for several hours listening to his presentation, and I learned an incredible amount of information about Civil War medicine that I had never been told about before, never known anything about it, even though I had an interest in Civil War history. So I think tonight's presentation is going to be a great look into who Dr. Edward Stonestreet was, but also how he fits into this bigger picture of Civil War medicine. And that's really important. And that's what we try to do at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So with all of that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Clarence. It is your floor. It is your show now. I will be monitoring the comments and hanging out in there with the folks in the comments. If you do have any questions, please drop them in there. We will get to them at the end. Clarence, take it away.
Thank you, sir. Share my screen. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to do a little bit about who Dr. Stonestreet was, but from my point of view, a bit about who he still is. So this is what we'll call this tonight about Dr. Stonestreet and his three roles in the Civil War. And I'm going to try to do this tonight. And I might skip around a bit, and if we don't get it all done, we'll maybe do it during Q&A. But I'll introduce you to Dr. Stonestreet, a bit about him personally, who he was, a little background, what he did during the Civil War, a bit about how he got involved, and the rapidity, the speed with which he was contracted. The Army needed help, and I'll tell you about that. And I'm going to do a little bit of then and now, a little bit of Civil War and 21st century in a few places throughout, including some things that Stonestreet was involved in that have come home to us today, transport of wounded, and a bit about the Army hospitals during the Civil War. During that time, hospitals often were places where people went to maybe to die. Civil War changed all that. And then I'm going to talk a bit about my service in the Army and the Civil War style hospital where I was stationed. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the war veterans who were Stonestreet's patients in the late in the 1890s. And then I'm going to show you this little museum that we have just refreshed with its new message, and where I am a volunteer. So we'll see how this goes here. This is the Stonestreet Museum of 19th century medicine in Rockville, Maryland. It sits on a City of Rockville historic park. And this was Edward Stonestreet's medical clinic from 1852, when he came home from medical school, until he died in 1903. He was in his 52nd year of medical practice. He never retired. He wanted to be able to serve his community and discharge his humanitarian service until the day he died. And that's exactly what happened. Now, when you're watching me here tonight, you'll see I'm looking back and forth. The sound that you hear is coming through my iPad over here, and I'm looking at my desktop to see all the slides. So I'm going to go back and forth just to make sure this all works okay. So I'll say more about this little place. This is what it looks like today. In the past, in the 1890s, this was Dr. Stonestreet's little medical office with his federal-style home in the background, right in the heart of old Rockville, Maryland. And this is the man. This is an 1885 photograph taken during a time when he was having some family photos taken, I think, in Washington, D.C. Edward Elisha Stonestreet, 1830 to 1903. His family, he was a lucky man with 6 daughters. I'm a lucky man with 2 daughters. 6 daughters, and they had photographs taken. This is an 1877 photograph of the 6 girls. And this is in 1885 when he had his own portrait taken and a family shot with the doctor and the Mrs. Stonestreet and the 6 daughters. And then in 1896, there was a big family gathering at the home, Dr. Stonestreet's home in Rockville. And in this photo, the doctor is here, his wife is here, the doctor's mother is here, and one of the daughters who was widowed at that time. And then the other daughters and their husbands here. Two daughters married ministers, 2 daughters married doctors, one married a businessman, and one married a lawyer. They were all very successful, all educated and successful, the women and the men. And then some of the grandchildren down here. When Dr. Stonestreet passed in 1903, he had 22 grandchildren. Blessed man. This was where he had most of his early education. This was the Rockville Academy, a very good private school to which you paid tuition. And it provided an education, according to some historians, equivalent to the first year or two of university. A very classical education which served him very well when he was applying to medical school. And this was a man who had a big influence on the young doctor. This was a mid-century, the 1840s, and at that time, if you were thinking about a career in medicine in some fashion, a physician, a surgeon, or maybe a pharmacist, the training began with an apprenticeship. And after the apprenticeship, it went to university. So this was Dr. William B Magruder, a local physician in Brookville, Maryland, a very well-liked, well-respected doctor with a wide-ranging practice out to about 10 miles all around. Now, 10 miles to you and me is not much, but back then on a horse or in a horse and buggy in nasty weather, a 10-mile trek from home to a patient's house was a big deal. And so he did that. And actually, Edward Stonestreet's same practice years later extended out to about 10 miles too. And then, unless you consider some of the hospitals in Washington, D.C., which expanded it even more. William B. Magruder took on Edward Stonestreet in 1848 after his secondary education as an apprentice. During his career practice, Dr. Magruder took on 5 different apprentices over time. And young men he thought he could train up and would be useful and helpful in their communities. Magruder, when he was a young man, was trained up by a man named Dr. John Tyler from Frederick City, Maryland. And Tyler was a friend of Thomas Jefferson and a member of the Electoral College, and cast a vote on Mr. Jefferson's behalf in the election of 1804. So I like to say here, that maybe stretching the point just a little, that Edward Stonestreet was trained up by somebody who knew a friend of Thomas Jefferson. That kind of gives me goosebumps. Well, and this is where he went to school. After 2 years as an apprentice with Dr. Magruder, living on the doctor's farm, reading his books, being tutored one-on-one, Magruder thought that young Edward Stonestreet was ready. And he took him from Frederick to Baltimore and helped him to matriculate at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. That's what you see here. This was the old medical building where all the training was done. And it was one of these old buildings that had these big domes. There was one dome on top of another. One was called Chemistry Hall, and one was called Anatomy Hall, these big circular classrooms where lots of lectures were given. This building today looks like this. It still exists. It's the oldest building in America that has been in continuous use training medical students from 1807 to the present. And it's very museum-like. You can go in and see this old building and see some of the museum pieces they have in there and take a walk back in history. It's very, very cool. And across the street from this old building back in the 1850s was this building. This was the Baltimore Infirmary, the largest hospital in the city of Baltimore at the time, 150 beds. It was the teaching hospital of the University of Maryland. Many medical schools in America during this time, mid-century time, did not have teaching hospitals. You got your practical experience with the apprenticeship, and then went and read medicine at the school. Well, the University of Maryland School of Medicine was very progressive, and it was designed on the European standard. The doctors and professors who formed the medical school were all trained in Europe, and they brought that to Baltimore. So this medical school was very progressive, and what it required of his students, I'm going to read a little so I don't make sure I get it right here, required the use of real cadavers for autopsies, a little bit unusual then, and for anatomy, required anatomical dissection. It required clinical work. Young students had to show that they understood clinical medicine. It required a doctoral thesis to be done for graduation, and for those students who could qualify, Edward Stonestreet was one of them. He was one of the clinical assistants and lived in residency in the hospital during his last year of medical school. The School of Medicine claims that they invented this concept of a medical residency where the medical students are actually living with the patients around the clock. So he got a very good education there. And one of the people who helped with that was this person. This was Professor Dr. Nathan Rhino Smith, a very well-known, well-established medical professional in the 1800s. He had written medical books, written books on anatomy. He had developed new instruments and procedures, and he was the professor of surgery at the medical school and the head surgeon in the hospital. And when Edward Stonestreet was in residence during that last medical year, Dr. Smith took him under his wing and trained him up in surgery, which was to serve Edward Stonestreet well for the rest of his career. Now, this guy looks pretty stern here, and I think if you were in his class, you'd probably realize that. But all of his students had a lifelong affection and love for this man because of who he was, what he did, how he taught, and how he made the students learn. Dr. Smith. This was one of the instruments that Dr. Smith had invented. He called it the anterior wire splint for the long bones of the leg. It was used for bone breaks. Apparently, it was very easy to use, easy to construct, and very, very effective. Both armies during the Civil War used this device. This was the cover of Edward Stonestreet's doctoral thesis. The university required a thesis. It could be a research thesis or a clinically focused thesis. Well, Edward Stonestreet wanted to go home and be a doctor in his community, so he took the clinical route. And it turned out to be an easy chore for him while he was living in residence in the hospital. So you can see this down here. It's dated, it says Baltimore, Maryland, March 1862. When I was researching Edward Stonestreet, I went to the university's archives in Baltimore, a big new modern building that sits on the site where the hospital had been. And the archivist helped me to find this, and I read his thesis cover to cover. I could photograph the cover as long as I didn't use a flash, just use my iPhone. And when I walked out of the archives that day, after having found this, I think I was walking about 6 feet above the concrete on the sidewalk, all the way home. Well, when Edward Stonestreet was in medical school, his parents had his little office was being made. It's now a historic structure, historic site in Rockville, and the historic marker on the front says circa 1850. This one, let me go back. This was right in the heart of Rockville, his office and his home in the background, this large federal-style home, which you see here. The main living level was on the second floor and above. This is the doctor and some of his family. This is probably 1890s. His medical surgery was on the ground floor beneath the stairway here. That's where he would actually see patients. The little one-room office was his sort of like his headquarters. He had his pharmacy set up in there and his chemistry, did all his reading, had his books, his patient's records and things in there, and he would dispense medication. But if a patient came to him, they would come here to the office in his home. And this is how he got around, mostly. He would go on horseback if he needed to get someplace quickly. But basically, he used his horse and buggy, and it's like a little pickup truck, you know, with a bed in the back. And when he'd get a knock on the door, somebody calling upon his services, he'd try to ascertain, well, what's wrong? Tell me what's going on here. Describe the illness, describe the injury, so that I can make sure I take with me all the right tools, instruments, medications that I might need when I get there. And that's part of what the buggy did. This is what it might look like in reality. This was not him. This is just an era of what that might look like in reality. It was convertible, and it can also be entirely enclosed in really nasty weather. We also know he had one of these. Sleighs were very common in Montgomery County in the 19th century, especially, you know, for winter travel. People had them for transport like this. We know the doctor used one of these in the winter. And on the farms, they had large ones that substituted for the big wagons that couldn't maneuver in the snow. And they would hitch the horse up to the sleigh and go about the farm work. Montgomery County, 2/3 of the county looked like this back in the 1800s. And a lot of it does now too, out to the north between Germantown and Frederick, and our agricultural reserve. And so Dr. Stonestreet spent a lot of time on the farms, helping with illnesses and injuries, helping babies to be born, helping with farm accidents. Farm accidents were common. One of the farming families to whom he was family physician for more than 20 years was the family of Caroline and Roger Farquhar, you see here. They had a 400-acre farm about 3 miles east of Rockville on what is now State Route 28, 400 acres. And they had 8 children. The 4 youngest are here. Edward Stonestreet helped to deliver 7 of the 8. And then there's this. In Rockville, when Edward Stonestreet started practicing medicine in 1852, there was no pharmacy in Rockville. This was 1878 when a doctor in medicine, let me see if I can do this here. Doctor in medicine, Dr. Daniel F. Owens, opened the pharmacy. And he was a medical doctor trained in pharmacy. So when that happened, it was a real boon to the physicians in the county, in the community, because they now had a professional pharmacist to help them and relieve them of some of that duty. But look, let's look at this just because, you know, this is the pharmacy, but there's also books and paint oils, artistic supplies, school supplies, paints, oils, window glass, varnish, brushes, toilet articles, stationery, and, oh, by the way, drugs and medicines. That has kind of a familiar ring, I think. You know, when we go into the CVS or the Rite Aid or whatever your local pharmacy is, you know, you can say, well, the pharmacy's way in the back. There's all this other stuff in here, but that's a trend that started a long time ago. This was late 1800s. And then this happened. This is what you're familiar with and why you're here tonight. And this is Edward Stonestreet, 1867. The earliest, oldest photograph we have of Edward Stonestreet, provided by one of the family members whom I interviewed when I was researching the doctor. So this was soon after the Civil War, the young and dapper Edward Stonestreet. I've been inclined to see maybe I change just a little and look like him, but I don't think I can look like him. And this was a friend of his. This was a classmate from the School of Medicine, 1852. Now, Edward Stonestreet, when the war broke out, there was a large federal draft provided by Mr. Lincoln in 1862. You know, the federal draft went to the states and the states to the counties. The counties provided the draftees, the recruits, the soldiers. So Edward Stonestreet and one other doctor served as the examining surgeons for Montgomery County, providing the physical exams on the draftees, the volunteers, the recruits, to see if they were suited for the life of a soldier. And this fellow here, this is Roberts Bartolo, Dr. Bartolo. He graduated in 1852, University of Maryland School of Medicine, practiced for about 3 years, and then joined the Army, became an Army surgeon. And it was Bartolo who got tasked during the war by Union Army Surgeon General Hammond to rewrite the Army's manual on examining for the surgeons on examining men during the draft and on examining men who might be eligible for a discharge of some sort. How to do that? So Bartolo used the existing manual that had been created by Charles Tripler, Dr. Tripler, and he blended into that the best of the manuals from Britain, Germany, France, and maybe another. He put the best of those together to create a manual to instruct the Army surgeons on how to do things. And one of the most of the manual has to do with the physical exam for a volunteer or a draftee, and how to do that properly, how to do it thoroughly, and how to do it in a way that didn't scare away some of these people who were volunteering, that would tell them that their private information would be kept private. So in some respects here, Edward Stonestreet was examining young men for their fitness to serve under some of the guidance that his classmate was putting together. And by my estimation, Edward Stonestreet was involved in the physical exams during the late summer and early fall of 1862, basically August and September, more or less. And I estimated that he examined about 800 men during that time. And I also estimated that he and the other doctor doing these physical exams examined roughly 25% of the eligible men in Montgomery County at that time. That was the intensity of the draft that came down from the federal government to staff up the Army. This was Roberts Bartolo in his later career. He was actually a very well-known, very famous, very successful physician, researcher, and university professor, Roberts Bartolo. Well, and then this event happened in 1862. And when it happened on September the 17th, the Army, the Union Army, both armies actually, but the Union Army out in Frederick was overwhelmed with the number of casualties and the number of wounded who needed medical care. And some new things were happening in the Union Army based on Dr. Jonathan Letterman and his revamping of some of the process and procedures for how do we deal with tens of thousands of wounded? What do we do here? And you know, of course, some of those things, one of them had to do with an ambulance corps, which I'll say a little bit about. But the whole city of Frederick, as you heard Jake talk about, became one vast hospital. And there's a book written titled just like that, where the whole city of Frederick, except for maybe one church, was taken over by the Army, and farmhouses and barns and all manner of facilities, and turned into temporary field hospitals to treat the wounded. And we're going to start there, and I'll tell you a little bit about what happened as we went through this. Now, when that happened, and the Army was looking for help, we need more medical staff. What are we going to do here? And the Surgeon General's office was trying to find qualified doctors to be able to help. And there was this man. This was Bennett Clements. He was an Army surgeon during the war, and in 1862 he was assigned to the Surgeon General's office in Washington and was in charge of the Army hospitals in and around Georgetown. Now, there were some of those places that the Army took over hotels and other buildings to become hospitals. Well, Dr. Bennett Clements was in charge of those in Georgetown and attached to the Surgeon General's office. And when they were looking for help, Clements said, I know a guy. Clements and Stonestreet were old school buddies from Montgomery County. And they must have kept in touch and known each other. And Bennett Clements told the Surgeon General, I know this man in Rockville who's been working with the Army, and he's qualified. And maybe let's get him down here and examine him. So I'm going to show you here and I'm going to pull out my notes again to make sure I get this correct. Edward Stonestreet went down to the Surgeon General's office in September of 1862 to be interviewed for the possibility of becoming an Army surgeon. And so his friend, Clements, wrote him a brief note of introduction to the Surgeon General's office. And this is a piece of that. And it says, Georgetown, D.C., September 24, 1862. And it's B.A. Clements, Bennett Augustine Clements, Assistant Surgeon, U.S. Army. So this is on the envelope outside the note that he wrote. And the note that he wrote looks like this. Georgetown, D.C., September 62. Doctor, this is to the Surgeon General's office. I beg leave to introduce to your acquaintance my friend, Dr. Edward Stonestreet of Rockville, Maryland. He has business relating to the hospital department in his town. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, B.A. Clements, and he addresses this to Surgeon Joseph R. Smith of the Deputy Surgeon General's office. So this is a little note saying, here's the guy I told you about. So this, and Edward Stonestreet then makes his way through the Surgeon General's office, talking to various people, being interviewed, maybe being tested, and notes are written on Clements's pieces of paper. So he then goes to see Joseph R. Smith, in the Surgeon General's office. And Smith jots down on this piece of paper, respectfully referred to Surgeon Abbott. He's referring Edward Stonestreet to go see Surgeon Abbott, medical director, for such action as he may seem proper. Joseph R. Smith, surgeon, Deputy Surgeon General. So Stonestreet then goes and meets this fellow. This is Joseph R. Smith, who was the Surgeon General's right-hand person. He was in charge of all of the hospitals in and around the Washington, D.C. area, and apparently got involved here when it came to finding and recruiting medical doctors to be helpful to the military. So this was R.O. Abbott. So Abbott then agrees that we should involve this guy, and so then it becomes a little more formal. We'll go up here so you can see this. It was a little more formal. This was the contract that the Union Army made with many doctors. This form that was filled in. This contract entered into on the 24th day of September, 1862 at Washington, D.C., not the state of, between Brigadier General William Hammond, U.S. Army, and Dr. Edward E. Stonestreet of Rockville. And it proceeds to lay out all the requirements and so forth. And then it's signed by some of the people who work under Joseph R. Smith, men named Alden and Underwood, assistant surgeons, and then E.E. Stonestreet signed it. This is the way he always signed his name. Edward Elisha Stonestreet just became E.E. So now it's official. After some scratching on paper, they make a formal contract. And then, on the spot, Edward Stonestreet gets his orders. He's now an Army surgeon. And the orders come, another written piece of orders scratched out here to get him working. It says, Stonestreet, E.E., acting assistant surgeon, USA, U.S. Army, to proceed to Rockville, Maryland. He's going home. And take charge of all the sick, wounded, and stragglers now there, and that may arrive, report their condition, and how many can be removed to Washington, D.C. Signed by the Surgeon General's office, the MDO, the medical director's office in Washington, September 24, 1862, 1 week after the bloody Battle of Antietam. So what happens? What happened here? Well, Edward Stonestreet was sent back to Rockville, where there was a new temporary general hospital created. The Army took over the county courthouse. This was the county courthouse in Rockville, built in 1840, with about 2 acres of ground around it. And the Army took over the building, took over the grounds around it, and turned it into a temporary Army hospital. I'm reaching for a book here. This was where, kind of almost like a way station, the wounded were being transferred from the field hospitals in Frederick to long-term care hospitals in Baltimore and Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and in Alexandria, Virginia. You know, when the Army moved out of Frederick, the Army took with it its own surgeons, and all the wounded needed long-term care. And the Army was in the process of building new state-of-the-art hospitals in late 1862 and early 63 to provide the long-term care for all of these wounded. And so this place in Rockville became kind of like a way station between Frederick and Washington, D.C. and Alexandria. Rockville is about 15 miles north of the center of Washington, D.C., and probably 30 or 35 miles from Frederick. And this was how many of the wounded were transported to their long-term care from the battlefields and the hospitals in Frederick City. these new state-of-the-art Army ambulances with uniformed soldiers whose job it was to drive them. Their job actually was to go out onto the battlefield, find the wounded, and get them to medical care as quickly as possible. And we know that Jonathan Letterman was in the process of testing this out. He knew they needed to do this. And the first real test of this new ambulance corps in the Union Army was the Battle of Antietam. History tells us now that the ambulance corps, people like this, went out onto the battlefields and they moved almost 10,000 wounded soldiers from battlefield to medical care in Frederick in 24 hours. That was unheard of. And the 24-hour standard became the standard. If we can give a soldier what he needs, a wounded soldier what he needs within the first 24 hours of wounding, he stands a much better chance of surviving. So that's what happened. And then after they got their primary medical care in Frederick, they needed to go to these long-term hospitals for long-term care, and they were headed down to Washington. A whole bunch of them went spread out all over the countryside. By my estimate, reading the history books and the book created by the National Museum of Civil War Medicine on the One Vast Hospital, I could show you that book. It lists almost 10,000 wounded soldiers, one by one, who they were, what their condition was, how they were treated, and where they went. And I went through every page of almost 10,000 soldiers and found out and kept a tally. And I estimated that, let me get this for you, make sure I get it right, about 744 soldiers were transferred to Washington and another 159 to Alexandria, Virginia for their long-term care. So about 900 soldiers. And a good bit of them, maybe all of them, went down through Rockville. And on this long trip of wounded soldiers in these horse-drawn ambulances, if they needed care on the way, they stopped in Rockville to the Army hospital that was created there. Now I'm going to read to you a little bit from this. You can see this. Dr. Stonestreet's biography. There's a piece in here about what some witnesses saw in Rockville when this hospital was open and the wounded were coming from Frederick. I'll read just a couple paragraphs here. After the bloody Battle of Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862, which killed 4,000 Americans and injured 18,000 more, we might talk about those numbers, the entire countryside was called upon to assist the wounded from both armies. Horse-drawn ambulances delivered casualties to Rockville. One observer wrote, "The extensive grounds of the courthouse were soon occupied by the soldiers who had fallen out from the commands, and many sick soldiers were already in the rooms of the courthouse, lying upon the bare floor. Help, Dr. Stonestreet. I was dispatched with the army wagon to farmhouses to get a load of straw, and later for a couple of sheep to be slaughtered for soup. This member of the U.S. Christian Commission, which cared for the spiritual needs of the soldiers, also held an impromptu religious service under the trees in front of the courthouse, where they had set up a lot of tents to form this hospital. An eyewitness, Mrs. Virginia Moore, lived along Rockville Pike in September of 1862. She wrote of seeing the federal forces passing on the road and stated, quote, "The nerve strain of seeing the train of wounded brought back with all of the accompanying horrors was almost unbearable." So that's kind of what was going on there in Rockville, and where Edward Stonestreet was assigned to provide this intermediate care. And I'm quite sure that young Edward Stonestreet saw conditions there and had involvement and experience with the wounded soldiers in ways that he never would have in his private practice as a country doctor in Rockville. So he was being as helpful as he could and learning a great deal, I'm quite sure. Well, a little then and now. You know, we go back to, this is the way the ground transport of the wounded was, the state of the art in the 1860s. That concept of the ground transport and the rapid movement of wounded to medical care looked a little bit like this during the World War I era. During World War II and Korea, it looked a bit like this. Part of the ground transport of wounded soldiers took on a look like this. And then in Korea, this appeared, the concept of a medical evacuation helicopter. You know, the Army's continually trying to do things better and quicker on behalf of the soldiers, like Jonathan Letterman did in the 1860s. You may remember that old TV show, MASH. the field hospital in Korea, and this thing showed up frequently. And you remember there was that one character in the show named Radar, and Radar got his name because he could hear the helicopter coming when no one else could. And when Radar would all of a sudden look up, all the doctors scrambled. There's wounded, incoming wounded, and it was this helicopter transporting 2 wounded soldiers who needed critical care. So this, with a little bit of time and ingenuity, became this during the Vietnam era. The workhorse of the military, the Huey Helicopter. These are still flying. We still see these all around the DC area and other places. They're still the workhorse. Then a lot of these were troop carriers. They would evacuate the wounded to a field hospital, but some of them, like this one, the medevac helicopters, also had medics in them. So the field medic who had treated the wounded could hand off the wounded to the medics in the chopper, and they could treat him on the way to the hospital. Good concept. And then this has morphed again to today in the military. I think this is a Black Hawk helicopter. You might correct me if I'm wrong there. I think that's a Black Hawk, right? Thank you, Jake. And these medics in the Army, and this kind of a transport now is a little more than just a transport. It becomes almost like a mobile emergency room with these trained paramedics. And then this eventually transformed to this. And I want to read you another something here regarding some of this transport. Now, this is the state of Maryland and the state police and the air ambulance that we see around, at least around here, frequently. And it was the state of Maryland. Let me read this to you, make sure I get this right. The state of Maryland in the 1970s procured an excess Huey from the military and used it for transporting wounded from accident scenes, mostly on the highways. And I would see this coming in here over where I live in Rockville and Bethesda, en route to the trauma center. The local suburban hospital in Bethesda is our local trauma center. And this comes in and lands on the roof with the critically wounded, critically injured. Well, I was wondering about how often this flew and how many patients they transported, with this technology that's come to us from the Civil War. Then, and there was a press release in April of 2003. The Maryland State Police issued a press release with the headline stating, "Aviation Division transports 100,000th patient." From the early like 1972 to 2003, 100,000 patients. Oh my gosh. In 1970, a single Huey helicopter began the program. And then the program, according to the state police, let me read you this. The program was based on wartime concepts. If patients were treated at the right place by medical specialists, their chance of survival would increase. And that was 2003, 100,000 patients. Thank you, Jonathan Letterman, and many others, of course. Well, now I'm going to digress a tiny bit and talk a little bit about Civil War hospitals, since Edward Stonestreet was involved in one, and I was involved in a kind of, show you just a little bit about that. This was the floor plan, the drawing, the schematic for the Satterley General Hospital that was in Philadelphia during the war. And this was the drawing of it, with the entrance being over here. The wounded would come in here into the hospital grounds. The idea was to have all these cantonments, these wards that were separate, all connected by central hallways, all with high ceilings and very well ventilated, where patients could be, patients with like conditions or like illnesses could be put together and treated and monitored and followed. And Florence Nightingale had a piece of this when she was in Europe and came across some of this concept and helped the Army to design what became the field hospital of the day. This is what it looked like in an artist's conception. Let me blow this up again here, just so we can get a view here of all the medical wards, all connected by hallways with the central support facilities in the middle. And see, here comes the wagon train of wounded coming into the hospital with the ambulance corps. So this was one of the concepts of the hospital that actually had a lot of value. And then we get into the 20th century in the 1950s, And this hospital at the top was the, let me see here, this was the Wakeman General Hospital in Indiana. And this one down here was the Valley Forge General Hospital in Pennsylvania, with that same design, the 1950s. This is 1952, Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I was inducted into the Army, with that same design still existing. Then there's this one. This is one I want to show you a bit about here, make sure I get the information correct. This is the U.S. Army Hospital at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. This is where I was assigned and stationed for 2 years. This was the mid-1960s, 1966, 67, and 68. Let me see if we can do this here. This building here was the hospital commander's headquarters. He was a full colonel and an MD, just like Colonel Potter in MASH. And then these are all the hospital wards, all through here, 70 acres of land, 7 miles of corridors and hallways in this hospital. This is the building where I worked. This was the clinic, one of the clinical centers here, and that's where I was working. The emergency room was over here, barracks for the hospital workers back here, the steam plant, the water tower, a complete hospital. And back here is the central facilities that included things like the mess hall for the workers. It was the barber shop, the bank, and all the support facilities going back through here to help run this hospital. Library was there. I used the library at lunchtime. And then the buildings themselves looked like this. 2-story buildings. This is the emergency room over here, 2-story buildings that were used for treating the wounded. I'm going to come back to the formation of these buildings in a moment here. The Army Hospital at Fort Campbell was built in 1942 during World War II, using that old Army design that was tried and tested, and it lasted until 1982, when it was replaced by a new modern medical center. Now, Fort Campbell is the home of the 3rd Army's 101st Airborne Division. That's where they're stationed stateside. So the hospital where I worked was in support and service to the 101st. This is a new modern medical center, which is really, really very cool, because it was, interestingly enough, it was dedicated in 1982. So that old hospital design that came to fruition, or whatever that word is, during the Civil War, lasted for about 120 years, with the hospital at Fort Campbell being replaced in 1982. And by the luck of the draw somehow, this new medical center was dedicated on September 17, 1982. 120 years to the day after the Battle of Antietam, and when those new Army hospitals were being designed and built around the country. Well, this is to give you a little bit of a little then and now, and do some comparison. This is Fort Gordon, Georgia, in the 1960s, basic training company. Ignore these these young heroes here. Aren't they beautiful? And look at the buildings in the background, the Army buildings. Here we are again at Fort Gordon. This is the company area for one of the facilities, and these old Army buildings. Now I'm going to show you a little contrast here in a minute about these buildings and their predecessors. This is a hospital I want to focus on right now because it really tells a good story about Army hospitals that doesn't exist in many places. This is the Mower General Hospital, Army Hospital, in what is now Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia. And this was a new state-of-the-art hospital. And let me get some facts and figures here. It ran during the war from 1863 to 65. It had a life with the city after the war. During the war, it treated 20,000 wounded over the course of that time, 3,600 beds, 200 surgeons, nurses, and ward masters worked there. 47 wards around the hospital, all connected by a central hallway, which I'm going to show you. Support facilities in the middle. And let me tell you about the support facilities of Mower General Hospital. This hospital had housing for medical officers, a chapel, library, post office, bandstand for performances, protection by guards, a fire brigade, which I'll show you, food preparation shop, storage houses, barber shop, laundry, dining room, fresh water from Chestnut Hill, gas lighting, indoor plumbing, hot and cold water. This was not a field hospital. This was a full-service U.S. Army hospital in 1863. Now, the next couple of slides I'm going to show you, let me blow this up again. So there's a railroad right next to it that could bring in wounded with the hospital train. Could also come in with the horse-drawn wagons on the roadway, and they come to this place. This is the entrance to the hospital. This is where the wounded would come through if they could walk. If they couldn't walk, they would be put on some kind of a transport and taken in this way. But what we're going to do here, let me back off. The next slide, we're going to be standing right here and looking at this two-story building here, and then the single-story buildings around it. We're going to be looking this way, and we're going to see this smokestack and this flagpole. So here we are, photographs by photographer John Moran in Philadelphia during the time of this hospital. There's the hospital entrance. This is the two-story building where a lot of triage was done on the wounded coming in. Now, what do they need? Where do they need to go? Which wards should they be part of? And if they can't walk in, they can be transported in this way. Another look at that, the roadway leading up to that main entrance to the hospital. And some of the wards here. And then let's see. I'm going to go back. Excuse me for a minute. I'm going to go back here. There's an overlook here that from which we're going to get a few pictures of the grounds from this upper vantage point. This is one of those from that upper vantage point, looking in the back to where that flagpole was, and the cupola and the bandstand and the parade grounds, and looking at a piece of the hospital. And you'll see these grounds or these gardens come up in another photo in a minute. Now we're going to turn around and look the other direction, looking back the other way. And this is part of looks like probably some of the quarters for some of the hospital workers. This is partly where they would be they would live here. And now we're down on the grounds. Here's that flagpole again. And we're looking back toward the administration building where all the work was done in the record keeping of the wounded and the administration of this army post. And then there's this little building here. We're going to see this little building again, right here. And the administration in the back. I'll show you the inside of that in just a minute. This little house right here is the quarters of the chief surgeon. The chief surgeon in the hospital had his own quarters, actually. And his name, see, he was, the surgeon in charge was Dr. I think it was John Hopkinson, Army surgeon, in charge of this hospital. That's his ground. And here's that little garden area. It looks like maybe the chief surgeon had some perks for all that they had to do there. And then there's, looking around the other way, still within the grounds of the hospital, this is the lecture hall here, where the doctors and staff could get together for lectures and sharing information. And of course, this is an army post, and all army posts need a guardhouse. And here's one of the guards. That's the brig in the Navy. And then this is a very interesting photo here. This is let me see if I can blow this up. Just a little, here we go. All right. This is the fire brigade doing a drill. And you can see there's water from a hose here. There was a water tank to provide the pressure for the water. And all these guys are getting out here, getting ready to do their drill. And I think there must have been some soldiers assigned to be in charge of the fire brigade. But oftentimes in the Army hospitals back then, they would call upon some of the patients who were well enough to do help around the hospital. They weren't well enough to go back to their brigade, but they could help out with things around the hospital. And sometimes they did things like fire brigade, or pulled the guard duty, or helped in the administration building. The Army had what they called the Veterans Reserve Corps, which was made up partly of these kinds of people who maybe couldn't go fight fully, but could take on some duties and help relieve some others of some things to do. And in this case, help to protect and guard the hospital against fire. And here's that water tower that provided the water and the water pressure for the hospital, and enabled drinking water around the hospital, and enabled them to have hot and cold running water. Indoor plumbing. This is inside the administration building, that big long building I showed you, where all the records were kept, and the probably the administration of all the hospital workers, all the soldiers, and the medical people who work there. And exactly what's happening here, I'm not exactly sure. But look here, see they have gas lighting in here. They also had gas piped into the hospital, and they have gas lighting. So they work 24/7. When I was in the Army, you were always on duty. Even if you were in your bed, you were on duty. And here's a look inside one of the hospital wards. These guys actually, I don't know whether this was staged or not, but they look fairly comfortable, like they're on the mend. They even almost look ready for inspection. Here's the high ceiling. We wanted lots of draft here, windows to provide ventilation. And also note they have the gas lighting in here as well. Pipes coming down with the gas at the end, with the flame at the end. And then this is the hallway. I mean, I'm gonna jump around here just to be sure. We're gonna leave that one and come back up here. Remember this hospital with the circular pattern and this hallway that went around connecting all the facilities. That's what you're gonna see here inside that hallway, connecting all those facilities with the grounds inside here and the wards all over this way. It's like a detail of a guard here, maybe regular Army and maybe Veterans Reserve Corps. But look over here, seating and drinking with the piped in drinking water. One of the things that might be helpful to wounded soldiers on the mend is to get out and get some exercise. Go out and walk the hallway, sit down when you need to, and there's plenty of drinking water. So let's back up now, just a little in this photograph, and see it from a distance. See the curve in this building, and let's do this again. There's that drinking water station. It looked like there's some spigots on both sides, plenty of water, high ceilings, and then you see this rail on the bottom here for rail cars that could be pushed and moved all the way around the hospital, transporting medical needs, transporting food, maybe even moving patients from surgery to somewhere else. Could all be done inside this long hallway all the way around the hospital with plenty of drinking water on the way. This was not a place to go and die. This was a place to go and mend. Well, and these were the ones that really intrigued me. You can't read what it says on the bottom here, but it says cooking department. This is a view of the hospital's kitchen for preparing the food for everybody there. All the patients and all the workers, all the Army helpers around, the medical staff. This is one view of it, and we're going to take and do a 180 and look the other way. Here again is that hospital kitchen with all these big things preparing lots of food, and you notice also there's gas lighting in here. A lot of after dark work going on in the kitchen. You know, one of the things that the Army learned and that the Army nurses often were in charge of in these big state-of-the-art hospitals, Dorothea Dix's professional nurses, they were in charge of nutrition, working with the kitchen staff here, the cooking department. The Army understood that good nutrition was important to healing, and the nurses often were instrumental in doing that. The nurses did way more than was in their position descriptions. I'm sure they did. We owe the nurses and Dorothea Dix a big favor, a big thank you. Well, that's the Army hospital. I'll look at the Army hospitals that you don't normally see, and a good example of the kind of things the Army was trying to do for the health and welfare of the wounded, to get them long-term care in a place that could do that. And I'm quite sure that when some of these wounded soldiers were transported from the field hospitals and the battle in Frederick and found themselves in a hospital like that, they'd think they were in heaven. You know, they'd get a haircut, they'd get a bath, they'd get all new fresh clothes, new shoes, a real bed to sleep in, and they'd get the best food they've had in all their time in the Army, and they'd be served by some nurses. I'm quite sure that some of those soldiers said to themselves, you know, I think I'm just going to tarry here for a while at the hospital. And they'd write home to their family and say, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. Well, then in 1863, Edward Stonestreet got involved again with the Army. His hospital in Rockville was closed in late February of 1862. So he was there administering that hospital for about 4 months. And then they closed the hospital in favor of the big new ones that he helped send soldiers to in Washington and in Alexandria. But in February of 1863, he was approached by a cavalry commander about helping with his very sick soldiers. And it was this Michigan brigade. In late 1862, a brigade of 4 regiments was formed in Michigan, and they were sent to Washington to help with the defenses of the federal city. 4 regiments, each regiment being 1,000 to 1,200 soldiers. And the regiment, the 6th Michigan Cavalry Regiment, was in and around Rockville. And one of the companies, Company M, needed medical help. And so the commander of Company M approached Edward Stonestreet, knowing he was trustworthy and capable, and scratched out another bit of help for the Army. And this reads up here: detachment of the 6th Michigan Cavalry Command in Rockville, Maryland, February 22nd, 1863. Harvey H. Vinton, captain, commanding the detachment of the 6th Michigan Cavalry. Enclosed a contract made with Dr. E. Stonestreet for medical attention of this command. So there's another contract, and this little note went with the contract saying, I've hired him again. We need help, and we know he can do it. And so for the next 4 months, from late February of 63 until late in June of 63, Edwards served again helping the Army. Then in late in June of 63, you may recall one of the things that happened there was that the Confederate Army under command of Robert E. Lee crossed the Potomac River into Maryland and was headed north. And the Army of the Potomac gathered up all their troops, including all the wounded and everybody, including the people Edward Stonestreet was helping, and they headed out hot on Lee's heels. And so the Army Hospital was closed in late June of 63, and that was the end of Edward Stonestreet's service to the Army. But we know that the Confederate and Union Army did meet in Pennsylvania at Gettysburg, and the Michigan Brigade was put under the command of a new, brash, breveted brigadier general in Gettysburg named George Armstrong Custer, who really shone as a cavalry commander during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, I don't know if Edward Stonestreet ever had the opportunity to understand that one of the companies of people he was helping, Company M of the 6th Michigan, had a piece of the victory at Gettysburg. I don't know about that. Well, so then Edward Stonestreet's finished with the Army, and he's back in full practice in the city of Rockville and in the county of Montgomery, in his little medical office, in the office in his home, but mostly he was out and about. I estimated that somewhere between 75 and 80% of Edward Stonestreet's interface with patients came where the patient was, making house calls, responding to accident scenes, and so forth. And this was Edward in 1877, still that dapper dude. I'm going to have to darken my hair a little, I think, to portray him. Late in the century, a couple of his patients were Civil War veterans. This was one of them. This was Colonel Henry Martin Robert. He was the Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C., and this is in the 1890s when the government in Washington, D.C. was 3 commissioners, one of whom was the Corps of Engineers district commander. That was Colonel Robert, the District of Washington, and he was the district colonel. So he was one of the body of governance in D.C., and he was a very, very busy guy, and he kept succumbing to his old bouts of malaria. When he was a young officer, a young lieutenant in Panama, many years before, he had contracted malaria, and it never really went away. And so his malaria was acting up in the 1890s, and he had family in Rockville. So he was going out to Rockville to get away from the work, which he couldn't really do. It followed him out there, stay with his family, and Dr. Stonestreet became his physician. And after some time, Stonestreet convinced him that he needed to get out of town for a couple of weeks, just go on holiday someplace and get away from it all. Let the medications help to help his condition. And he did that, and apparently he was better off afterwards. Now, he had a very distinguished career. when he retired, he was commander of the Corps of Engineers. He was, I think, a brigadier commanding the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And he had a brilliant medical career, or Army career, helping during the war with the defenses of the Philadelphia Harbor in Washington, D.C. But the thing he was most known for was something that he did in the 1870s. He hated going to meetings where nothing happened, no decisions were made, people walked out with nothing to do, it was just talk. So he created a little booklet to help run meetings and how to organize meetings and get things done. And he called it his Rules of Order. It became Robert's Rules of Order, which is still in use today in many places. And that's the thing he's most remembered for, aside from the fact that he was a very brilliant and successful military man. Another of Stonestreet's patients was this man. This was Admiral Stevens. Now, Admiral Stevens was a two-star admiral, and when he retired, he was commander of the Pacific Fleet. And he was retired in the 1890s, living with family in Rockville, and Edward Stonestreet was his physician. And he died in the late 1890s with Edward Stonestreet at his side. And he was very well known as a naval commander and very successful in serving his country. Both Admiral Stevens and General Robert are buried at Arlington. And this is the museum today. This was the doctor's medical office. It's moved around town a little bit, but on special days in Rockville, we bring out our doctor's buggy, and I do an interpretive program about the country doctor as well as the Army doctor. And right now, there are actually three of us. Dr. Stonestreet, myself portraying him, then I have a life-sized mannequin that I dress as a wounded soldier, and he gets treated by the doctor. So the three of us are kind of in limbo right now, doing Zoom versus things in person, which I'm coming to enjoy doing and being helpful here. So this is his museum, the Stonestreet Museum of 19th Century Medicine. We closed the museum in the early 2019, emptied it, and we repainted it, spiffed it up, took care of the old floors and the old stove in there, and then we reassembled it with a new, better, easier to understand, much more broad message of 19th century medicine and a bit of the Civil War, which Dr. Stonestreet had a part of. His story is an American story, not just a doctor here in Rockville. He was doing what doctors were doing all over the country, behaving and acting in ways that they were, caring for his community the way he did, and being called to service and saying, yes, sir, when that was needed. It's an American story. Well, this was October of 2019 when we reopened and rededicated the museum. There you see the old doctor in the middle, and we did a ribbon cutting. And this is Dr. Stephen Rokower, who represents the Montgomery County Medical Society, of which Edward Stonestreet was a founding member in the 1800s. And the medical societies helping sponsor what goes on here. And this is Elizabeth Lay, the curator of the museum. And I am the interpreter. And we had a jolly time doing a ribbon cutting and reopening the museum to the public. And so this is a bit about how are we doing on time here, Jake? I don't want to overdo it. We okay? Can't hear you.
I did it. All right. Yeah, ready for a Q&A in just a bit here.
Okay, I'll do this quickly then. Just talk about this little museum. What we've done in here is part of it has to do with describing the practice of medicine in the 1800s from the middle of the century to the end of the century, the time occupied by Edward Stonestreet. And here this cabinet talks about the old heroic techniques of bleeding and cupping and leeches and what that was and was not, and how that morphed through the middle of the century, being influenced by the Civil War and the medical things that happened there. And then toward the end of the century, when the practice of medicine was the dawn of modern medicine in America. It was becoming very modern and using modern techniques and asepsis and sterility and so forth. And that's all explained in this little one-room building. One of the shelves, we do a little bit about STEM, S-T-E-M, science, technology, engineering, and math, the things that help us today working together to solve problems. Back then, it wasn't called STEM, but that process was well at work with things. And one of the examples is the stethoscopes, the old monocular stethoscope monaural, to the more modern design here. and how that happened with the engineering and the science of the day, answering the call of the medical community for new ways to do things, new and better ways to do things. And we could have decorated the whole museum with this. But just to give the public an idea that the 19th century had its problems, but it was also a time of burgeoning information, burgeoning science and learning. And so just a little bit of an example in the time frame here with a smattering of different disciplines of geology, cell biology, Mr. Darwin, the new studies of genetics, and the chemistry, the table of the periodic table of the elements, and down through the physics. Things are happening in physics and medicine. This was all happening in the 1800s when Edward Stonestreet was, with his colleagues, struggling a little bit and trying to do the best they could for their patients. And then by the end of the century, we have things like asepsis and antiseptics, carbolic acid and tincture of iodine, and some new modern bandages that provide sterile bandages that the doctor could take out to the farm and be helpful there. And then, of course, there's the A. I put an A in STEM, STEAM, A for arts, humanities. That's the communications that make every discipline work. We have a collection of medical books, periodical, historically correct medical books from the 1800s. But look over here. Behind the glass, there's this telephone from the early 1900s. We know that Edward Stonestreet had one of these in his home. A telephone service came into Rockville in the 1890s. Edward Stonestreet had one of these. I know a couple of his patients did. So when one of his patients had a phone and he had a phone, he could be reached quickly. Someone didn't have to ride in on horseback from the farmhouse and knock on the door. And the doctor could talk to the patient and understand a bit about what was going on, provide some advice, decide whether he needed to be there in person. Now, this was the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. These last couple of months, today in this year, I've had 3 telehealth visits with some of my personal physicians. And I thank them for making a house call by a Zoom, which we all chuckled at. But this concept of being able to talk to your doctor today without going to make the visit during this pandemic it is very high tech. But it began back in the 1800s with this concept of new technology, the telephone. Well, then there's the country doctor. We have a whole display about the country doctor and how the country doctor served his community. And there's a little test on the side for what happens if the doctor gets called to different emergencies. What does he do? And you can read about that in the museum. This is what it looks like today. And this is the Civil War Trails marker next to the building. We are in the process. This old marker needed redoing. It's weather worn, and it was a good opportunity to do some revamping of the message here based on our new information, new scholarship we know about the old doctor. So this is what the new marker is going to look like, and with a little bit of luck here, it might get installed this summer. We're hoping that it will. And to give an idea about Edward Stonestreet, country doctor, an army surgeon, to whom I just introduced you, and it has been my pleasure to do that. And you can talk about this if you so inclined, Jake. And I would say thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarence. I imagine folks at home giving a little clap, a little round of applause for Clarence. If you do want to go back to your previous slide. Excellent. So this is a book that is available through the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You can, I'll put the link to where you can, to the email address of our store manager, where you can contact if you would like to purchase this book. You can purchase it through the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'll be putting that email address into the comments in just a moment. If any of you do have questions out there for our speaker this evening, for Clarence, please drop those into the comments. I do have a few to get us started. So let me pull those up here. All right, so this goes back to the very beginning, and this one's from Andrea. Thank you, Andrea, asking questions throughout. This goes back to the medical school that Dr. Stonestreet attended. She asked about whether or not they enrolled women.
I think they were. I think I think the answer to that is no. At that time, all the rosters of students I recall seeing when I was researching there, I think were all men. I think at that time this would have been, he was in school there 1850 to 1852, middle of the century. I think it was a little later in the century when women came into more prominence in medical schools, and by the turn of the century, I think that barrier was broken in many places. Probably not all places, but many.
All right. Another one question here from Robert Smith, who asked a lot of great questions throughout. I have another one from him in just a second. And his question is, before the war or after, did Dr. Stonestreet have any close relationships with other Maryland physicians who ended up as Confederate sympathizers or in service of the Confederacy, like Richard Spriggs Stewart?
I don't think so. Not that I know of. All of the colleagues of his, whom I'm familiar with through history, I think were all Union. But now the rider on that is that when the war broke out, and doctors went to volunteer to help with the war, they went both north and south. And all these doctors, the Confederate surgeons and the Union surgeons, were all trained in the same schools, because it was the U.S. of A. then, whether the school was in South Carolina or in Maryland or in Maine. So they were all trained the same, just like the Army officers trained at West Point, but went north and south. But the people who I am familiar with, who were his colleagues, were all Union, as far as I know.
All right. Good question here again from Robert Smith about hospital design, and you went into some great length about this and how hospital design kind of continued from the Civil War up through well into the 20th century. He brings up a good point and then asks the question. He says, hospitals were traditionally built near waterways or rail lines to allow ongoing upward evacuations. When was that abandoned in the design and location of Army hospitals?
Ooh, that's a good. I'm not sure I can answer the when and what is it abandoned, but yes, they were put places where they could get services. Like this one, the one in the slide here, was placed here because there was a rail line and because they knew they could get water from the city of Philadelphia to run the hospital. Then, of course, there was Washington, D.C. that had many. Washington, D.C. became sort of the hospital hub of the Union, and that was partly because of location, services, and rail lines going in and out of the city, roadways going in and out, and then the Potomac River and the port of Georgetown, where hospital ships could come in. And so it was cited there for those reasons. Now, when did they stop doing that? Well, the hospital where I was stationed at Fort Campbell is in Kentucky. The nearest place you may know nearby is Nashville, Tennessee. Just over the line we were, and out in the countryside, and where there was land that could be developed, I expect. I don't recall there was a river right nearby. There were some nearby through Nashville and the Cumberland River and others, but not quite like the same in the Civil War, when they needed to be close to things like that. Mm-hmm. In the more modern times, we can pump in water and services. That's just a speculation here. That's a good question, though. That's a fine question.
And another one, just a quick one from Robert, is about the garden you posted there, a picture of. And he wondered if there would have been medical botanicals grown in that garden.
Yeah, so let's see here. This garden here, we're talking about near the chief surgeon's quarters. It doesn't look like it is a functioning vegetable garden. It looks more like it's, a nice place to go with the walkways in here, a place where people could go out and maybe just get some fresh air. Now, I don't think that's the case here, and I suspect that if the Army needed, the Union Army we're talking about here, needed medical supplies and medications, medicinals, they'd order that. They'd have that shipped in from the supply houses in place. They didn't here, at least, need to do what the Confederate Army needed to do in places around the South when they were running out of supplies because of the Union blockade and other things. They had to turn to nature in a lot of ways to try to help their they're wounded, which I expect Robert understands that.
Yep.
Thank you.
And another one here, another question here. This one's from Lynn Bristol. Thank you, Lynn. Sorry I didn't get this in earlier when we were talking about the medical schools. Go back to the medical schools for this question. What was included under the practice of clinical medicine in the philosophy at Maryland Medical School in the mid-1850s? Did this include the, I always mispronounce this, I hope I get it right, the pharmacopoeia?
Yes. Yes, one of the courses that Edward Stonestreet took was called chemistry and pharmacy. They needed to know that. And when he was the clinical assistant in residence in the hospital, he was involved in everything that happened in the hospital, including illnesses, injuries, to all manner ages of people. One of the cases he took on one night was a sailor who got into a knife fight in a bar near the harbor. The harbor was within walking distance of where the hospital was. And this guy came in all cut up. And Edward Stonestreet started attending him, realizing he needed a little more help, called on surgeon Professor Dr. Smith, who came in and they helped this guy. He was in the hospital for about 2 weeks and eventually discharged. And in that regard, I'm not sure whether I'd say that Edward Stonestreet assisted Dr. Smith or whether Dr. Smith assisted Edward Stonestreet. But together they worked and did that. And all manner of clinical work was required for a patient to understand what was going on. And when the Dr. Smith arrived in the morning and the patients and the medical students were with him, he took them around through the hospital. He required them to recite the medical history of every patient they were attending so they could all see and learn what was going on and what was to be done to help that patient. So it was a full hospital with the knowledge and the equipment they had at the time. And Edward Stonestreet, in his doctoral thesis, talked about a lot of this clinical work and the kind of medications and things that he administered to his patients. And he also talked about that knife fight and the surgery. When I looked at all of the doctoral theses from his class of 1852, the written theses, his was the only one that had in it a surgical case. They were all otherwise were clinical medicine.
All right. Excellent. That is going to mark our last question that we have here. So I'm going to end our screen share. So it's just back to the two of us. Excellent. Well, Clarence, I want to thank you so much for coming on with us this evening and for giving this fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much, Jake. It's a pleasure and a privilege. You know, I was originally scheduled to do this presentation at the Pry House in June, but then the pandemic came in and we're making other arrangements. So I'm glad to have this arrangement and be able to help. I am a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, an occasional volunteer. You know, when some things happen that I can contribute, I'll be glad to do that. And I wholeheartedly support what Jake said earlier about the mission of this museum becoming a member. It is not just a museum about the Civil War in the 1860s. It does a lot of what you were witnessing tonight that I was trying to do, bringing some good news and doing some then and now, how we got to where we are based on where we were, and the importance of the Civil War in all that.
Excellent. Well said, Clarence. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you to all of you out there for tuning in with us and for engaging in the conversation. We had a lively chat going on in the comment section, which is always great to see. Thanks for interacting. Thanks for hanging out with us this evening and learning a little bit about Civil War medical history. If you did enjoy the video, click that like button, click that share button. Even though the video is coming to an end, you can allow more people to join into that conversation even well after this video is posted and goes up on our Facebook. You can find it permanently, all of our videos, on our Facebook page. You can also find them on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's YouTube channel as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you did enjoy the video tonight, consider going over to the comment section and hitting the button where it says civilwarmed.org/support. That's where you can become a member or a donor. Well, we will see you next time. This is Jake Wynn from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, signing off with Clarence Hickey. Hope you all have a great evening.
Stay safe.